Hi, my name is Ari Kelman. I'm the Jim Joseph Professor of Education and Jewish Studies at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. I'm very happy to be here at the Magnus Museum, where I'm going to speak about learning at the Jewish Cultural Festival in Krakow. I hope you enjoy the talk.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Etta said a lot of people are in the room already, so that maybe we could start. I have no idea what time it is. Is it 6:30? Oh, great. We'll start on time. So let me first thank the people who sponsored and co-sponsored this, which I guess includes us, the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Theological Union, first and foremost. No, this is co-sponsored, obviously, by the Magnus, by Lehrhaus Judaica, and the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley, as well as the Center for Jewish Studies, the original Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Theological Union. So thank you to Etta for organizing this and for inviting me to introduce Ari Kelman, our local boy made good. I'm just going to introduce him in case not everybody in the room is related to him. I have to say that when Etta asked me to introduce him, I basically would come to hear Ari Kelman talk about anything. I mean, if he wanted to talk about, I'm trying to think of what the most boring possible thing could be. No, I don't know, maritime law in the 14th century, I'd probably come. So that's my endorsement of Ari, but obviously you know that because you're here. So Ari Kelman is the inaugural holder of the Jim Joseph Professorship in Education and Jewish Studies at Stanford, where he also directs the concentration in education and Jewish studies. I'm going to skip many lines here, or as he says, blah, blah, blah. He's doing lots of things at Stanford, but apparently getting paid for one job. He's the author of a few books about American Jewish life and culture, including his first book, which I am very fond of because my father was in Yiddish radio. His first book is called Station Identification, A Cultural History of Yiddish Radio. I wish I had thought of that. And then his second book is Sacred Strategies, Transforming Synagogues from Functional to Visionary. So it's interesting because the functional synagogue is the part that I found surprising. And that won a National Book Award. Which one? The National Jewish Book Award. Okay. Right now, his new project is exploring how it is that people learn to develop religious sensibilities, which requires him to go to church. And to KRAKOW, Poland, and he also goes to a lot of B'nai Mitzvah. I told him if he just waited 10 years, he'd have to go anyway, but he said he wasn't sure he'd be Jewish in 10 years. And he also is spending a lot of time in archives listening to the religious music of the early 1970s, an excellent period for religious music. So everybody welcome Ari Kelman. There will be a Q&A afterwards.
That was like the best introduction I've ever gotten. Thanks, it's always great to be back here in Berkeley. It's a great place to be. It's a great place to be, it's a great place to be from, and wonderful to be at the Magnus. Thanks to the Center for Jewish Studies, also at UC Berkeley, for inviting me, to Claude Fisher, who can't be here, and to Ed and Ashley, who helped make everything happen. So this is a project that has been I've been working on very slowly for the last couple of years. This is the first time I'm actually sharing some of this information in public, so I'm looking forward to a pretty lively Q&A when I finish. In the summer of 2013, I dragged my family to Krakow for the summer, and so this is a little bit of like what I did with my summer vacation 2013 edition, but I was there with a very serious purpose in mind, and that was to spend time at the Krakow Jewish Festival. And I went with a very explicit ethnographic agenda, and I'll talk more about the festival in a second, but I went with a very specific ethnographic agenda born of my position at Stanford, which is studying Jewish studies within the School of Education. So I'm surrounded by people and increasingly involved in conversations about learning and about structures that are supposed to facilitate learning. And I thought, as somebody who didn't come from education, didn't study schools, that a cultural festival would be a great place to begin to understand this question. For a variety of reasons, I decided that Krakow seemed like a good place to start this venture. I don't know if that's turned out to be a great decision. But the question I went with quite explicitly was, how do people use the festival, this particular festival, to learn about Jews and Jewish culture? And then I located this version, or this portion of my inquiry in Krakow at the Krakow Festival. What affordances does the festival offer to people who are interested in learning about Jews? And to think of it not just as an occasion of cultural representation and reproduction, but a site of cultural production as well, and if that changes the sort of terms of the educational endeavor therein. And I was there, and I was working with a couple of people, and I spent the whole week doing as much festival as I could. And then at the end of the week of the Krakow Jewish Festival culminates in a huge public free concert in the kind of old town square of the Jewish quarter of Krakow called Kazimierz. It's called Shiroka Street, and the concert is called Shalom on Shiroka. And that's on Saturday night at the end of the festival it takes place. And so I was there Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, sundown comes, it's the end of Shabbat, and the chief rabbi of Poland and a few other functionaries of the religious community get up on stage to lead Havdalah. So to formally, ritually, religiously end the Sabbath, so that presumably the concert could continue as it was going on before, because there was music being played all afternoon. So I went and I heard this. So, Debbie recognize that melody? Right, so that's the Debbie Friedman tune to Havdalah. And that's my camera work, so I apologize. But there's at this point in the evening, there's like, I would say probably 8,000 to 10,000 people crammed in this square. So it's a lot of people in this place. It's hard to imagine the density, actually. But there they are on stage, and singing Debbie Friedman's Havdalah, and it raised this strange question in me, like, here's a group of people on stage who not only sort of wouldn't recognize the kind of Judaism Debbie Friedman has become somewhat of a folk hero within, but would not shake her hand, would not acknowledge many aspects of her personality and her being, and nevertheless, this was their performance this was the melody they chose to perform when performing Havdalah to a crowd of largely non-Jewish Poles. So clearly things were more complex even at this stage of the festival than I had imagined when I started. So I got to wondering, what kind of performance was this? What kind of pedagogical moment was this? What were they trying to instruct the crowd? If the festival is a kind of week-long stage for the presentation and production of Jewish culture, what was being produced in this moment? It was a very strange one for me. So what was happening here, and for whom? Who was the imagined audience, and to what end? And it got me really thinking, I think, a little bit more deeply about what kind of learning could happen in a place like the festival, for whom, and what were the terms of that learning. Now, I should say that I was hardly the first to go with questions about what was going on at the Krakow Jewish Festival. I follow in a long line of people who have already, I wasn't even the only person at the festival in 2013 who was studying the festival. I come on the heels, really, of a long line of people who have been asking questions like these, which were similar questions to the ones that I came up, people like Ruth Ellen Gruber and Erica Lehrer, Jack Kogomas, and a bunch of others who have written, I think, incredibly thoughtfully and helped me think about how I am approaching the festival. But they ask questions like these. How and why has Krakow become a center for Jewish cultural celebration or revival? What does the celebration of Jewish culture mean in a country with a relatively small and Jewish population? Also, obviously, the site of the decimation of Eastern European the Eastern European Jewish population in the Holocaust. What are the politics of lost memory and rebirth around Jewish culture in Krakow and in Poland more generally? And the question that always comes up, well, then is this a sign of cultural rebirth rebirth, or is it just fetishization? Is this sort of legitimate Jewish culture, or is this kind of Disneyfication? And so, and these are these are the kinds of questions that I find routinely when I delve into this literature that people are asking. They're terrific questions. They're questions to which I certainly don't have answers, although the people who came before me offer some. And the research typically falls into one of two main frameworks. One deals with the symbolic meaning of Jews in the space of Krakow and in kind of Polish memory, and the critiques of the festival generally cast it as a sort of festival, a Jewish cultural festival without Jews, in the kind of dismissive, critical way. Jewish Disneyland, which many people could say about the sort of Jewish-themed restaurants that line that square. Ruth Ellen Gruber and Genevieve Zuritsky have this idea of virtual Jews, that is, they're sort of virtual projections of Jewish culture, but without sort of actual, real flesh and blood Jews to be the subjects and sort of bearers of those cultural performances. Erica Lehrer has a lovely idea of unquiet spaces and what happens to Jewish culture when non-Jews become shepherds of Jewish culture, which I'll just flag and say was one of the reasons that I went to Krakow in the first place. Which I can answer in the Q&A. I can talk about more in the Q&A if you want to. And finally, the tension between rebirth and exploitation, and what is quote unquote actually happening in Krakow. I think probably all of these things are happening, and then there's probably like 1,000 other things that are happening as well. But one sort of cluster of research on the Krakow Jewish Festival and in the Jewish cultural scene in Poland more generally falls into the bucket, I would say, of symbolic meaning. The other deals with questions of identity. And identity then falls out in a couple of different structures. So Polish Catholic identity, Polish Jewish identity, diaspora Jewish identity, what it means to diaspora Jews who travel to Poland, either on organized tours like March of the Living, or diaspora Jews from Israel who come to visit. European Jewish, so sort of looking at Poland as part of Europe, and trying to situate Polish Jews within the European Jewish context. And finally, the questions about Polish national identity and what the reemergence of Jewish culture means for the Polish nation, as it were. All of these also are super interesting, and again, they've helped me try to figure out my own contribution to the research. But I found as I was reading them that both the cultural sort of symbolic meaning camp and the identity camp, and of course they overlap, I found them ultimately sort of dissatisfying, because I found them that they were all trying to pin down a meaning on this very complicated, incredibly dynamic, vexing and confusing and multifaceted phenomenon. And so I tried to narrow in on the festival as a site, an ethnographic site, and I tried to focus on learning. So why do I think learning is a good frame in which to approach this phenomenon? Well, for me, learning moves it from an object that can be studied to a location in which something is happening, sort of draws boundaries around a field. I think that it helped me anyway think about people as creative actors rather than fixed entities, instead of saying that one has an identity or one is such a thing, to think about people as actors within and among different forces of those things. And I'm happy to talk about identity, in the Q&A if you want to more generally. That I look at experiences as information, not artifacts. So again, trying to move away from a model that approaches these things as fixed entities that can be kind of pinned down, whose meanings become discrete and I think sometimes ossified, to a more dynamic understanding of what kind of processes are at work at the festival. And that's the final one. I'm not interested in pinning down a particular meaning of the festival, but I'm interested in the way that the information that is produced, shared, transmitted, created moves through the people who participate in that festival. So more social, more dynamic, I think, than some of those other frames, although again, I want to say that the work that other people have done on the Krakow Jewish Festival and on the revival of Jewish culture in Poland in general has been and continues to be extremely valuable to me. So I was interested in not necessarily the meanings that were produced in these places, but how the festival occasioned the construction of meaning, looking more at the festival as a site of process as opposed to product. But I had to first get a handle on the product itself, that is, what was this festival? So I will spend a minute just giving you the briefest overview of the Krakow Jewish Festival. How many people have been to the Krakow Jewish Festival? Okay, and how many people have been to Poland in the last, decade or so? Okay, cool. So the Krakow Jewish Festival is it's 25 years old. It just celebrated in 2015 its 25th anniversary. It was established in 1987, so before the end of communism, as a film festival, a kind of underground film festival. The intention of its creators, and that intention which carries through till today, is that it's not an ethnographic or a folkloric festival. It's really the intentions of its creators and the director that it be a festival of live culture. This is not a retrospective attempt to sort of show how Jews used to live in some like reconstructive diorama museum kind of way, but a real way to what he sees as celebration of real Jewish culture as it's being lived today kind of all over the world and bringing it into Krakow. And finally, he sees it also as a reply to anti-Semitism in Poland. Those are, I would say, like kind of the three pillars, the two pillars of the festival and a little bit of background. As I was making my way around the festival, though, I discovered the festival is actually three different things. It consisted of three different things. It consisted of daytime workshops. I'll talk about those in a second. Evening concerts, which were bigger, were open to the public. The workshops and the evening concerts were ticketed events, differently priced according to venue and according to content. And Shalom on Shiroka, which I mentioned before, which was this big, free, outdoor concert. I was told by a number of people that it was the biggest public event in Poland annually. I have no idea if that's true, but that's what they told me, so I'm telling you. And this is over on this side is just it's a snippet of one part of one page of what's a pretty hefty schedule book that you get at the festival. They're sort of scattered all around Kazimierz during the days of the festival, so you can find the places you want to go. And you can buy like a festival pass, you can buy just single tickets to events. There's a bunch of ways to opt in. The evening concerts tended to feature performers from around the world: Israel, Europe, the United States, Latin America. People, pretty big names. I'll get to those in a second. The workshops were smaller, led by real experts in the field of Jewish culture and Jewish cultural arts, and they included workshops. So this was a klezmer workshop that I participated in all week. I didn't bring my instrument, but a lot of other people did. That is, they came prepared to learn and to play, and we played a lot. We sang a lot in that room. This is a lecture. I think that might be Rabbi Michael Paley at the front, but you can't see him. So there's workshops, there's lectures. Here's another music workshop led by Michael Alpert. Real people like I said, real experts in Eastern European Jewish culture who were there to teach and to sing and to participate themselves. We did a lot of singing in Michael's workshop as well. The year that I was there was a graffiti workshop where two graffiti artists from the United States came and worked with the Polish, worked with anybody who wanted to go to the workshop to devise and then put up this piece of graffiti in an abandoned sort of lot in the corner of Kazimierz. There were workshops for kids, so this is a kids singing workshop. You can see them. They're blurry because kids don't sit still at the bottom of the frame there, but you can see the lyrics projected up there. And then the evening concerts from very close up looked something like this. The year that I was there, they take place in the temple, which is the renovated old synagogue, one of many synagogues in and around Kazimierz. So there's one, that's Frank London's back. He's the one in the fedora-looking hat. This is another one, and another performance. This was a Friday afternoon tea dance that was out in a public square, where some of the musicians and some of the workshop teachers played, and people danced in one of the squares. And this is a scene of the stage from very close up of Shalom on Shiroka, a band called Zion 80 that was playing that night. And here's another shot of looking away from the stage, sort of all the way back up the square, so you can see the crowds. And this was fairly early because it's light out still. And as the night went on and the acts got sort of bigger, the square filled up like front to back, side to side. Here's another shot of that. So I was interested in I was trying to get a handle on the festival. The festival is actually three different things, but I was able to, I think, get at some of this by, again, not think of it as one target, but as a kind of set of moving targets. And trying to understand the opportunities and occasions that the festival created, that were created in this week or 10 days of events, and for whom and for what purpose. So it meant that I needed to approach the people who I was studying, not as like sort of fixed opinions, but as people who were going through a kind of process through their engagement with the festival, whatever that engagement was. So I hired 3 Polish graduate students, 2 of whom were students at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. One was already a master's student and was working at the Auschwitz Museum. And I met with them and I trained them and we got up to speed on what we wanted. We did a lot of participant observation, so we had passes to the whole festival and went to everything that we could. We did about 120 interviews, approximately 70 non-Polish interview subjects, about 50 Polish interview subjects. Interviews ranged anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour and a half. And we took a ton of pictures and movies. So we really, I felt pretty good that we covered as much of the festival as we could during those days. And it meant that we looked at people as learners. So what did it mean to look at adults as learners? So we were looking primarily at adults. Our IRB prevented us from talking to children, but also most of the people who went to the festival were adults. And the kids who were there were all accompanied by adults who brought them there. So primarily adults, which meant that they were self-motivated. They had to get themselves, they had to find out about the festival, they had to get themselves to the festival, they had to figure out, they had to navigate the ticketing, they had to navigate where things were in different buildings around town, and they had to get there. They were pretty self-regulated. There's a very self-selected group of people who participate in the festival, at least in the workshops. The bigger you get, the more general the audience becomes. But they were self-motivated, they were self-regulated, they were constructivists, and I'll talk about that in a second. And they were highly volitional. They made choices throughout their engagement with the festival, what they wanted to do, what they didn't want to do, and how they wanted to do it. And that came through very strongly in the interviews. They charted their own ways through this thing called the festival, which again led me back to that thing of this, led me back to my, it helped me learn or helped me understand that this was a process. This is not a fixed thing. And the only way to understand it, I think, is by approaching it in that dynamic framing. A friend of mine who studies who studies museums, a friend of mine who studies Jews says, you can only teach people what they already know. And George Hine, who's a well-known scholar of museums, says that museums are really good at teaching people things they almost know. And that's a lot how I thought about the festival, was that the festival was really good at teaching people things they almost knew. And I'll explain how to move them along that, how the festival kind of creates opportunities to move along that process. I'm going to skip Diego. And so I mentioned that they were constructivist learners. Constructivism is a learning theory, a theory of education, in which that posits that as opposed to the sort of banking model or the behavioralist model of education, which is that information is given to somebody and then the person reacts to that information, they absorb it, and then they act in a different way based on it. The constructivist model, which grows out of Piaget and Lev Vygotsky mostly, is that people should be and are active creators and constructors of their own learning processes. So that so that it's not just a matter of a new piece of information goes in and my worldview reorients and then I act in a different way, but that I take that new piece in, and the act of fitting that new piece into what I understand, how I understand the world to be, is actually constructive. I'm not just absorbing information, but I'm helping make new information in the process. And so it posits not that learners are passive recipients of information, but they're active producers of information in this process. They're not absorbing information, they're constructing knowledge. The crux of constructivist learning is that it's experiential, it's participatory, and it can take place either in formal or informal places. I was interested in this project in the informal places of the festival, and I was interested in the social dimension, the social dimensions, the contextual nature, and the role of narrative in learning about the festival. Oh, this was supposed to play. This was one of the work. This was a dance workshop. This was supposed to play while I was talking. And I turned the sound off because the sound is really bad. But you can see sort of all of these things. The teacher is not interested just in telling people about dance. He gets people up, he gets them engaged in dancing as they're learning about the dance and the different movements. So what do I mean by social? I mean that people develop new new knowledge, people build knowledge in relationship to other people. They are not individuated learners, but the context really matters and shapes the way they're able to assimilate and produce and create new information, and that learning happens in particular contexts. So in the case of KRAKOW, it's important that this festival is in KRAKOW and not, say, in Berkeley, California, or something. That context, the context of Kazimierz, the context of the people who end up at this festival in the moments in which they participate, help to shape the ways in which people produce new information about Polish life and Jews and memory and the Holocaust and so on. The learning is always happens in relationship to other people. Contextual is that learners are not just, they're agents in the production of knowledge, not merely consumers. These things happen in particular contexts. They're not blank slates. People bring with them their own understandings of how the world works. Unlike the kind of other models of education where the student is a blank slate and your job as the educator is to fill it out, constructivist learning appreciates the ways in which people, appreciates the tools in the background that people bring to class or bring to learning environments, and tries to kind of mesh new information, mesh new information with extant bodies of knowledge that allow the learners to produce new knowledge. And so it really relies on prior knowledge for the production of new knowledge. It doesn't assume that anybody's starting at base zero. Finally, learners make sense of knowledge through narrativization. And this was, one could say that this was an artifact of our research method because we asked people to tell us stories about their experience at the festival. So we got narratives, we asked for narratives and we got narratives. But I also think that the process of putting new knowledge into a narrative, whether it's a specific narrative about a particular event, or whether it's the narrative of one's life and what one learns at a various point in that process, is part of, it is an act of making that information legible to other people. And that is a constructivist act. It involves metacognition, which is a fancy way of saying thinking about thinking. But it involves a certain amount of self-consciousness that much of the learning sciences in the field of education understand as being really important to people's ability to produce and assimilate new information and make knowledge out of it. So narrative ends up being really, really important. We heard a lot of different stories over the course of our research at the festival. We heard stories about rebirth in Poland. We heard stories about children of Holocaust survivors coming back to Poland for the very first time. We heard stories from Poles who are just enamored of Jewish culture. I heard a great story from a young Italian woman who was being trained in conservatory to be a clarinetist, realized that she hated playing in conservatory, and one day was like, heard a friend gave her a klezmer CD, and she was like, "What's that? I have to know what that is," and began playing klezmer music with her friends, and is now, it's just the only kind of music she wants to play. She said she was going, we met and had lunch, and I interviewed her, and I said, "What are you going to this afternoon?" And she said that she was going to a genealogy workshop, and I said, "Oh, why are you going to a genealogy workshop?" And she said, "Because I'm hoping that I find out that I'm Jewish." Which I think also just captures this, some of the strangeness. I don't know, I sort of pressed her on why that mattered to her, because here she was playing music, and I didn't get a very good answer to that question. I think maybe I pressed it a little bit too hard, but it also spoke to the very complicated ways in which culture resonates, and that cultural producers, people become cultural producers of a form that's sort of not native to them, quote unquote, although I don't know. I know a lot of Jews to whom klezmer music isn't native either, so anyway. But we heard over the course of the research two main constructs that came through very, very forcefully. One was about religion, and one was about what I'm calling global cultural citizenship. Global cultural citizenship is not a phrase that anybody that we spoke to used. But it's a framework for understanding what they were, for understanding what they were talking about. And I'll give you now a bunch of examples of how these two frameworks took shape in the narratives of the people that we interviewed. And I'll explain after we go through these how it is that I think these are instances of learning in the vein of producing new knowledge and new information. So first, religion. So we didn't. I should preface this by saying we didn't ask about religion. It was not, for whatever reason, it was not on our interview protocol. It wasn't a factor that we thought was important, but when we started interviewing people, people started talking to us about religion, specifically their religion specifically. So here's one from Edward, who is Polish. Although there aren't any Jews in my family. If they were Polish interviewees, I should say that the interview was conducted in Polish. I had them translated and then transcribed, or transcribed and then translated. So these were conducted in I don't speak Polish. My research assistants did speak Polish and do speak Polish. So Edward said, although there aren't any Jews in my family, because Christianity comes from Judaism, every Christian should respect their older brother. Here's another one. Jana from Poland said, I'm a believer, I'm a Catholic. For me, it was also a religious experience. My daughter asked me during the service whether it's good that we're here. This wasn't a worship service, it was a cantorial concert that usually happens like this all-star cast of cantors, all men, male cantors, who perform on essentially the opening night of the festival in the temple, and it's a big event. My daughter asked me during the service whether it's good that we're here, and I said it's not a sin that we pray in the synagogue. I, of course, according to my conviction, think not. We grew from Judaism, so that does not interfere with our faith. He was, of course, beautiful, the singing cantor, and the same source of spirituality or religiosity that I loved. Here's Maria from Poland also. As a Christian, although not perfect, I know that our roots are in Judaism. The pillars of the Catholic Church, St. Peter and St. Paul, they were Orthodox Jews. The early Christians that were Israelites, Jesus too was a Jew. The interest is so natural for me, it stems from my identity. So for Polish Catholics, the encounter with religious performances, and in that I put the cantora music, and in that I put things that probably weren't expressly religious. And I also, by the way, put the performance of Debbie Friedman's Havdalah at Shalom on Shiroka in that bucket. The exposure to difference reinforces a kind of continuity for them. It gives them evidence both of their own faith, but also of the ways in which Judaism, in particular, can dovetail with their own understanding of Christianity, allowing for difference, but essentially arguing for a kind of cultural continuity between the two forms. The second narrative that we got was that of global cultural citizens. So this was Morris from Australia. I know I'm Jewish, certainly not a problem, but that's kind of how he said it, but with an Australian accent. But I'm a citizen of the world. So I think coming here is a chance to immerse myself back in the incredible feeling of Jewishness. Morris's parents were from Poland, I should say. And of course, the other thing is I hear the harrowing parts of the past. His parents were Holocaust survivors, and so he grew up with this narrative. And it's good to hear it in retrospect from other mouths because I've heard quite a lot from my parents. So it's just, in a way, amplifies and to some degree fills in the story for me. Anna from Poland said, it's part of our history. Many things are unknown, and you need at this moment to learn not only about Jewish minorities, but about others, these, meaning Jews, and Lemko, which is another kind of ethnic minority in Poland. There are other minorities. It's simply the thing you should know. Alicia, who's from Australia, I hope that through this exhibition, there were a couple of different, there was a photo exhibition, there was an exhibition of little figurines of Jewish people, of Jewish figurines. Is that clear-ish? There were a couple of exhibitions. So I think through this exhibition, people will see the Jews as a separate group because as we all know, Jews are very, very different. The exhibition has certainly a large educational potential. Overall, as I said earlier, the exhibition just raises empathy. Joanna from Poland, there are some specific facts about Jewish culture, but if introduced, it can raise awareness that the world is made of more cultures, more symbols, more nationalities. And finally, Danielle from the United States. I'm not Jewish, I'm a little Roman Catholic girl from New Jersey. But I love the respect, like respecting other religions. I'm also a religious studies major, and I love understanding other religions. And I think this, meaning the festival, is a great way to do it. I come to these discussions to have great festivals, but not really imposing your views on other people. And I was thinking about these themes of the ways in which people were making sense of their experiences in the festival that introduced some new material, but nevertheless connected to kind of extant narratives of how the world is organized or how the world ought to be organized. And I found myself thinking these things when I was sitting, when I was at Shalom on Shiroka at the end of the festival as well, and thinking about the ways in which religion functioned both as a site of disjuncture that is of real difference. Jews are really different than Catholics, but of also continuity that is there's part of the same spiritual tradition. And this was a way of making sense of Jewish culture largely for Polish Catholics, although it came up more but lesser from many of the people that we interviewed from outside of Poland. And finally, the ways in which a presentation of culture like this one can play a part or comes to play a part in a general kind of liberal global sensibility about cultural difference, pluralism, multiculturalism, all of which are, well, multiculturalism more so than the other two certainly are part of the European conversation. What it is to be a modern European, what it is to be a modern citizen of the world involves that level of multicultural respect, tolerance, and so on, and an awareness of cultural difference. And again, in that context, it comes out as Jews are different, but they're kind of different like everybody else is different in a multicultural world. And so this is a way to come to learn about Jewish culture, and for the learners, it was an opportunity to encounter something and build new narratives around that something, to construct meaningful frameworks for it. And I think actually that the chief rabbi of Poland, Michael Szydryk, and the other religious representatives of the Orthodox Jewish community in Poland who sang Havdalah were also playing part of this game. We're also borrowing from elements of culture that were not native to them. Debbie Friedman is not native to Chabad. And we're also, perhaps unwittingly, picking what was a kind of popular or well-known melody, perhaps the best-known melody, to Havdalah to suggest a way of making Jewish culture more accessible to an audience that was not necessarily, again, sort of largely comprised of Jews. So how do people use the festival to learn about Jewish culture, Jews and Jewish culture in Krakow? They do it by constructing knowledge, not by assimilating knowledge, or not by just absorbing knowledge, I should say. So they do it through the mobilization of a religious narrative in which religion assimilates Jewish difference into a narrative of continuity and sameness. It doesn't sort of expose ruptures or seams. It's very, encounters with religious performances become part of the narrative of Christianity, or in this case, Catholic faith. It allows for that difference, but it also dampens it somewhat. And I think that's true for Jewish and non-Jewish participants, for performers as well as for audiences. The second mode that we saw this evolve in was in the global cultural narrative, global cultural citizenship narrative, in which Jewishness represents one expression among the many that make up the multicultural world. And to be a citizen of that world, one needs to have the proper perspective on other cultures. And there isn't room within that for a sort of baseless hatred or anti-Semitism. Again, I should say, I will return and say, people ask me, like, well, is there really anti-Semitism in Poland? I have no idea. Is it rampant? I have no idea. The people who I talked to, the people who I studied in this project, who I interviewed, who spoke to me, were A, people who wanted to speak to me and my research assistants, and B, people who chose, again, in this self-motivated way, to go to the festival. So these are not a representative sample of Poles. This is about people who, for a week at the end of June and the beginning of July in 2013, chose to spend part of that week, or all of that week, in Krakow, attending workshops and concerts, and sort of hanging out in the scene of the Krakow Jewish Festival. So again, oh, that's right, I forgot about that. I'm on this new asthma medicine, though, so it's making me cough anyway, but the water will be good. Thank you. So the specificity of my question is actually quite intentional. I don't want it to try to speak to what's happening in Poland now after the elections. I can't speak about sort of broad cultural trends. I just haven't done that research. But I was interested in, and again, that's why the relationship between people and the festival are sort of at the heart of this question. The festival is a kind of technology or an occasion for producing a particular kind of learning about Jews. Jews and Jewish culture. The ways in which those are manifest then take the form of those, of the construction of meaning and the construction of knowledge through participation of the festival. So festival participants construct meanings of Judaism that are grafted onto Christian origin narratives. They construct theories of global citizenship that frame difference as a kind of equalizer. And they construct connections between their worldviews and the culture encounters that the festival provides. the festival provides these experiences and these frameworks. They also provide a sort of steady stream of new bits of information, new kinds of music, new songs, new performers. Oh, I didn't know that Jews did this. Cooking was extraordinarily popular, cooking workshops, art workshops, lectures, and so on. So it's not just about a kind of contentless experience. There's content there. You kind of need a little friction in the machine for people to grab onto to create the momentum that allows for this new narrativization, or the production of new knowledge around Jewish culture at the festival. And so paradoxically, or what I think is really interesting at the heart of this, is that the festival then, it both challenges people's notions about what Jewish culture is and what Jews are, and it allows them to reinforce their own notions of how that fits in their worldviews, which I think that dynamic, I think, is really at the heart of this, at the heart of my question, or at the heart of the answer to my question of how learning takes place in this setting. So I'm going to jump over that. I will leave you with this beautiful shot of the exterior of the Temple Synagogue and the logo from the festival, and just conclude by saying that the role of the festival in the production of this knowledge then is to coordinate and perform these efforts, to create spaces in which adult, self-motivated, self-regulated, metacognitive learners can encounter new information, wrestle with it, and both, in some cases, reinforce their own notions of the ways in which the world works, and in some cases challenge those notions. And the festival really succeeds as an educational environment in providing a whole range of opportunities for that to happen over and over again. And they do it, it happens in this particularly thorny, complex, multifaceted, very difficult corner of the world. And it happens among the people who want to lay claim to its inheritances. Thank you. Yeah. I don't know. So we'll go down there. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for an interesting talk. A couple of things occur to me. First of all, seems that you could interpret this festival as a kind of pilgrimage. If it's an annual event and it's drawing people from all over, another thing that occurs to me is that the one thing that really unites Jews all over the world is the one thing that is basically missing there, which is the religion. Because, I mean, the culture of Jews from Iran and Jews from Poland and Jews from India are very different. So the people themselves were kind of inserting the missing element into the narrative that they were giving you and your informants. Now, I was curious about the interviews, and I noticed in one of your slides, the one about narrative, there was a picture of what I thought was a page that had to be filled out. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah.
And it said, how do you see Poland's Jewish figurines? What does that mean exactly? What were you looking for?
That's a good question. That was not my sheet. We didn't have people fill out anything. That sheet. So those are great questions. All of them. The sheet was posted in the museum that housed the exhibition about little Jewish wood-carved figurines. So it was designed as a museum, a very low-tech museum interactive, so that you would go through the exhibition and you would see the figurines, and then it was one of a handful of opportunities for visitors to the exhibition to share back in a more interactive frame. So that wasn't our, I actually have no idea what, if anything, was ever written on those pages, and I didn't collect them. I could find out if you want. I could ask the curator of the exhibition.
I was just curious if this was an example of the kinds of questions that were being asked.
No. Ours were much more open-ended.
The other thing is the way culture, which is such a broad and complex phenomenon, is in this festival, and in all festivals usually, condensed into a few salient symbolic items like food, dance, music, things like that. It's a very it's something that's designed for easy consumption,
Right.
let's say.
Right.
It's entertainment. It's entertainment.
Well, I mean, it is entertainment, and I think it's education. I'm a huge believer in the educational power of entertainment.
Oh, yes, for sure.
And in an earlier version of this talk, and perhaps in the fuller-bodied version that I write up, there was a whole section on kind of tourism and pilgrimage. Jack Kogomas writes about it quite articulately, the pilgrimage of American Jews to Poland and sites of memory and so on. One of the interesting things that I found, and one of the reasons that I took it out, was that when I looked across the interviews that we did, there were a number of people, particularly from outside of Poland, who my expectation was that they were there very intentionally, were there quite accidentally. They said, oh, we were already on our, like, I met some couple from New Jersey, and they're like, oh, we were already on our kind of tour of Eastern Europe, and then we heard that this was going on, so we made a special visit here. Or somebody from England who is at a Bible college in England, and they happened to be in KRAKOW for a week studying at this other Bible college, and they heard the festival was going on, so they popped in. So yeah, it's part of that huge tourist apparatus, and I was thinking about the Komaroffs as I was like writing this, and I decided to take that part out. I'm happy to talk about that more because I think it's part of it, but I think that sort of the reduction of the engagement around culture to kind of commerce isn't quite fair to the complicated production of meaning that's going on, I think, in this festival and probably in other festivals too. So I wouldn't go that far, I think. I'll let Ashley pick people, it's easier.
Ari, thank you. I'm really excited that you're speaking about the festival as a site and process of learning. Having been there now for maybe 12 years, it's definitely how I see it. I see so much evolving creativity. And speaking as a Jew, and as a Jew who goes there to meet up with my friends and colleagues who are involved in Polish-Jewish studies from the US, Israel, and Europe and Poland, it's a place of experimentation, it's a laboratory, it's a place where people come together. I've seen so many collaborations come out of the festival, and I've seen so many marriages come out of the festival. And it's actually more and more, you probably looked at the catalogs one year to the next, and the intellectual content of the lectures and the panels, first of all, they're highest quality, they're packed. It's much less entertainment than it is people coming for a lot of intellectual content during the day. But I'm curious to know, because I see a lot of Jews going there to learn, not just to perform or to present. And I was wondering, of the 70 non-Poles, or of the 50 Poles, what percent, who was Jewish? What did it mean for the Jews who were there? How did they learn? Because Jews learn there too. And so along with religion and global cultural citizenship, which I think are both really important constructs, I'm wondering if there's also a Jewish element. And then my last question is, did your overall research project shift? Because I remembered originally, or maybe it still is this, that you were studying different Jewish festivals.
Yeah.
And that this was the only Jewish festival that wasn't produced by Jews.
That's right.
And what does that mean in terms of?
That's a really good question. I mean, it's hard to separate the fact that it's not produced by Jews from the fact that it's in Poland, which again, my other sites were in the United States or in North America anyway. And so it gives it the sort of the history of that place and the history in that place is so strong that, I mean, for me, it's in some ways stronger than, that is more interesting in some ways than the fact that it's produced by non-Jews. As for your other question, the difference between Jewish non-Poles and Jewish Poles. Jewish Poles were there and they were proud and they were really excited to be there to be part of the festival. Some of them would go year after year, some this was their first time. I couldn't find a good pattern among Jewish Poles other than the fact that they were very excited to be there. And they were going to everything that they could. Jewish non-Poles, the vast majority of them, and there weren't that many, actually. But Jewish non-Poles were talked about memory, they talked about loss, they talked about Holocaust. Sometimes people like the gentleman that we heard from, whose name is escaping me, Morris, thank you, had parents or grandparents who had survived the Holocaust. But for them, the entire, for most of them, the whole experience of the festival was framed within loss, memory, rebirth, and for some of them a certain amount of discomfort with the fact that there were non-Jews sort of putting on Jewish culture. That came up a bunch of times. So that's what I got.
I wanted to ask, so I had a question about the different festivals because the thing that immediately comes to mind is Limud. And so I was wondering if you had thought about the comparison between Limud, and maybe you've looked at Limud and can make that comparison between Limud and this festival. And I also wanted to ask a demography question. So I'm curious to know, when you talk about the global cultural whatever, it sounds very millennial to me. So I'm wondering if, in fact, that's what you found. I'm wondering about some of the gender distinctions, whether that mattered at all, or other demographic distinctions that might be there.
I looked for gender, I looked for age, and I was surprised, I think, like you were, that I didn't find much variance along those axes when I was doing the analysis for gender or age around these two narratives. There were other axes where age in particular showed up. And there were a lot of women there with children, and not very many men there with children. But otherwise, in terms of the sort of the creation of these narratives, I didn't find much variance along those axes. As far as Limud goes, I think Limud was kind of in and out of this other work that I was going to do. So I've been to exactly one Limud conference, and I have not studied it, either the phenomenon or the conference. But the primary difference between the festival and Limud, any Limud, take your pick, is Limud is volunteer staffed and volunteer run. This festival is a massive undertaking, hugely well organized. And they both sort of fly in and fly out, the artists, the teachers, the performers. They take very good care of them while they're there. There's flocks of volunteers who are working at the festival, but it's not a kind of peer-to-peer thing in the way that Limud is, which is, I think, one of Limud's real strengths. And it's also, I think, the variety, that sort of three-tiered structure of workshops, which is where Limud's kind of main thrust is, and then the slightly bigger evening concerts, and then Shalom on Shiroko, which is this like massive free outdoor concert, I think differentiate from Limud in some significant ways.
Hi.
Hello.
Excuse me. For the Poles who are there, who come from small towns that may have been 50% Jewish before World War II, or cities that were up to 30% Jewish, and it didn't seem to be a theme from what you presented versus the Jewish experience of someone going to the festival as a way of doing an exploration of family and loss and memory. So I don't know if you would venture a theory as to why or psychologize about it, but it seems to me that there's something. I mean, these are self-selecting Poles. There's something about the absence in Polish life of the sort of Jewishness, the richness, and the integral place that Jewishness played prior to the war. And why was that not a theme or a construct, or why didn't it play into their explanations?
I mean, certainly some of them talked about the Holocaust. They were all aware of it and what it did to the Jewish population. It was what I can say is, in our interviews, it was not the driving motivation, and it wasn't, I would say, again, because we were looking at how it was that they turned these experiences, how they made sense of these experiences. it was not a primary sort of trope or refrain in the ways in which they were making meaning out of their experience at the festival. It may have been what motivated them, it may have been what tickled them to come. It may have even been part of a broader framework that we didn't pick up on. I think all those things are totally possible. But it was not part of the ways in which, in our encounters with them, they explained how they were making sense of the festival in that moment. It's certainly a very powerful backdrop, right? That is, you sort of, were it not for those historical events, you wouldn't sort of need the festival to do the kind of work that it's allowing these people to do.
Thanks. I have two very different kind of questions. One is, I was kind of a reaction. I was very surprised, never having been there, of course, to hear that Debbie Friedman Havdalah was being used. Not a traditional Polish tune, I imagine. And I'm wondering what that says. I mean, so much could be said about that, but what that says about the authenticity of the Judaism or Jewish culture that is being presented by the organizers who are choosing who the performers are. Even if the performers are a number of rabbis in this particular case, they are performing Judaism for those who are there. Secondly, I'm wondering, and this is perhaps more methodological and kind of sideways, is makes me start thinking there must be a huge research literature on this constructive education related to festivals which are around the world, all kinds of things, yoga festivals, music festivals, all kinds of things that mix entertainment with learning in various degrees, which I think is different from conferences,
Yeah.
which, like Limmud, it's really not about the entertainment. Maybe it's a matter of degree, but I mean, there's so many people going to these things, especially among millennials, that it would seem like a real locus of adult education in some interesting way, what education means.
Yeah, I assume the festival has some good data on the demographics of people who go. As far as the literature, there's a huge literature on constructivist learning theory. There's a small literature on cultural festivals. There's almost nothing on the intersection of the two, which is why I am very happy to be doing this project. The work on cultural festivals tends to be of the pilgrimage type, tends to be of the tourism type, both of which are, I think, strong refrains in this festival and not that different. Your other question, your first question, authenticity, yes. So I loved that moment when they sang the Debbie Friedman. It came really for me out of nowhere. There's huge question. Well, what I loved so much about that moment is that it reveals the ways in which authenticity as a refrain about labeling something good or bad works. That is, it is not an old, sort of an quote-unquote authentic old Jewish melody. We pretty much know who wrote it and when it was written. Nevertheless, it was their moment on stage to perform Jewish authenticity, which they did with their clothing, and they did by performing a religious ritual in the middle of a outdoor concert. And so, which for most of the people there didn't matter. Halachically, it was weird because there was like 3 hours of concert before the Havdalah, and then there was Havdalah, and then there was more concert. And so for me, it's not a matter of like, oh, that's authentic, that's inauthentic. It's not any less authentic for me to sing Debbie Friedman than it is to sing some like Moditzer or Niggin, or to sing something by Shlomo Carlebach or something else. They're all performances. And so for me, the sort of absorption of Debbie Friedman into the cultural practices of these Orthodox Jews is exactly the point. That the conversation on authenticity has to be more complicated, and it has to allow for performances, cultural transmission, cultural exchange, that and I think this is also is really important, that's separated it from the people who sort of quote unquote originally made it. Because you have in that moment a melody being sung by somebody who literally opposes the existence of the person who wrote it. So the sort of the creator of that cultural artifact, that melody, right, could not have stood on that stage with those men for so many reasons. So what's so interesting is, nevertheless, the culture is able to travel. The cultural artifact is able to travel in ways that people can't. And I think that, in Krakow, is particularly interesting, and which is why, for me, I'm particularly because of that moment, and I don't want to make that moment stand in for the entirety of the festival, it allows and people to move. It allows culture to move in ways that people can't. And it allows culture to move in ways that trying to fix identity, I think, prevents. And so once we can, and this is really hard to do, separate people from culture in a certain way, if we can imagine that cleavage happening, the production of Jewish culture by non-Jewish Poles becomes less problematic. Shana, you look like you're trying to jump in. Sure.
So my understanding of that moment, and I've heard it many years now, is that is two things. One is the chief rabbi and the other Orthodox and Chabadniks who are up there are actually singing to the Jews in the audience who know that tune. That's one. And not just the Jews from the United States, but also the Polish Jews who self-select the music, the tunes they like for their services. And so whether or not Debbie Friedman could be up there, no, she couldn't be. But that music is a part of what this traditional community has become. Right. And also, it's a traditional community with many contradictions. Orthodox Jews in Poland march in gay rights parades. And, that's a whole other story. But that's part of it.
Thanks, Shannon.
Ari, this is a question about non-Jewish klezmer bands in Poland. And if the non-Jewish interviewees from Poland indicated that they had seen klezmer bands and they understood that the musicians were not Jewish, and if so, whether they indicated some differences that they experienced with the Jewish klezmer musicians at the festival.
It's a good question, not that come to mind. I read with one of my research assistants an article or two in which there was a discussion about the sort of Jewish provenance of klezmer music. And that is to say that if Jews were a part of Polish history for very long, then Jewish music is Polish music. And so in a certain way, again, sort of like Debbie Friedman, and it's like the inverse of the Debbie Friedman story, they also have a cultural claim on that musical heritage as non-Jewish Poles, because there's a way in which it's Polish folk music. And so the fact that they're talking about those kinds of, that some people are talking about those kinds of questions, I think is, helps to inform the ways that the festival is productive and generative of these kinds of conversations.
Ari, thank you very much. It's a fascinating presentation. The question that I have is, does the festival, as it's been developed, present Jewishness as a kind of timeless entity as compared to what's going on in Warsaw at the Polin Museum, which is trying to give a 1,000-year history of the life of Jews in Poland? And how does that make a difference?
I mean, it's different in all kinds of ways. I think primarily the curation of the festival and the content of the festival is very much focused, is very presentist. That is very much focused on contemporary performers, teachers who are steeped in the knowledge necessary but who are active on the scene. Often they're teachers who are also performers. And so I would say that it's very focused on contemporary life, on contemporary Jewish cultural production. Not so much, there are historical aspects to it, so there's lectures about history, there's exhibitions about history, and so on. And there are probably also from year to year, because it differs, sort of presentations of more and less folkloric Jewish cultural registers or artifacts. But I think it's undertaking a very different project than the museum, which is massive and static, the story, because the museum has walls and it has things on those walls and you can't move things around on the walls very easily. The museum is static. I think the learning that happens, so the narrative of the museum, and by the way, on your seat was a little like announcement sheet of upcoming talks. The very last talk in the series on April 3rd is Barbara Christian Black-Gimblett, who's the kind of creative force behind Polin, the Museum of Polish Jewry. She's an incredible woman, and she will tell an incredible story about the creation of that museum. So I really encourage you to go. It's a nice bookend. You can ask her that question, Paul. She'd have a lot more to say about it than I.
Jews lived in Poland for about 1,000 years. The life between non-Jewish Polish people and Jewish Polish people was sort of intertwined. Do you think that this kind of past life contributed to the camaraderie that happens in these festivals?
Certainly, that history is with the opening of Polin, the Museum of Polish Jews in 2014. That narrative is becoming more prevalent. So I did this research in 2013, so before the museum was open. But then that narrative, it didn't come out a lot, the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. In the way that I think now it's becoming more, that phrase, the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, is now kind of. It's like almost it's a sentence stem in and of itself that people use to talk about Polish Jewish history in shorthand. It wasn't in the conversations that we were having very much while we were at the festival. But I think, so even though it wasn't articulated in that way, I think that understanding of this very long history of Jews in Poland and the long relationships between non-Jewish Poles and Jewish Poles, and the desire not to reduce all of that history to the years, say, between 1932 and 1945, is alive in a lot of the narrative. Sort of, I would say, probably just beneath the level that we were able to pick up in our interviews.
And I think that the evidence that all the Polish people who helped the ghetto uprising tells me that they had something in common.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between, this is now moving far out of my area of expertise, but sort of the place of Poland in World War II, the place of Poland in geopolitics in the years following World War II, kind of 1945 to 1989, give or take, is extraordinarily, I am finding it increasingly interesting. I'm just not a historian of Poland enough to really speak intelligently to the relationship between, or the things like the Ghetto Uprising and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or the Warsaw Uprising and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and what the kind of cultural or social connections were between those two events, because it's not what I know comfortably enough to really talk about. I think there's one more, two more.
Maybe you have any information about it. You talk about the film festival. Can you talk something about it?
The first film festival? So it started as a film festival in a like an underground. It was underground. It was like word of mouth, and it was in a small kind of arts theater, and they like sold out sort of night after night. And the people who put it on kind of said like, oh, there's something here. Don't forget, this is 1987, 1988. It's right towards the end of the communist regime in Poland. It's right before Solidarity. It's as Solidarity is kind of picking up steam. So the appeal of sort of underground work, the possibility of underground politics, of cultural resistance, and the role that Jews played in that kind of cultural resistance, I think, factored into the success of the festival. And my hunch is that they did film because they could get film. They weren't going to start flying artists in, right? It's in 1989. It's a pretty low budget. It's a pretty low budget cultural festival. At that point, they weren't going to start flying artists in, and that would raise all kinds of concerns with the ministries of interior and so on, in ways that they could kind of throw a low budget. I suppose literature would have been like even easier, and I don't know if there were like reading groups that ended up influencing their idea to put on a kind of proper festival.
Last question. Did you get a sense from your interviewees that
the polls go out of any kind of sense of guilt or responsibility. And I came late. Who actually puts on this? Are these people Jewish?
The director of the festival, who's been the director of the festival since its inception, is a guy named Janus Makush, and he's not Jewish. He is as fervent as any Jewish cultural fan I've ever met, but he is not Jewish. As far as I know, he's never expressed any desire to convert. That would almost make no sense, but he's not Jewish. His second sort of assistant, Robert, is also not Jewish. I don't know the makeup of the rest of the leadership. It's hard to know for sure, and the volunteers are drawn from all over the place. I mean, I didn't ask. And if you ask, like Michael Shudrick, who's the chief rabbi of Israel, how many Jews are there in Poland? Chief rabbi of Poland, sorry. Chief rabbi of Poland. If you ask him or any of the sort of leaders of the Jewish community in Poland, how many Jews are there in Poland, they couldn't tell you. They joke that it's the only Jewish population in the world that's growing even with a kind of zero birth rate, because there's a small generation of people who come from Jewish grandparents who have sort of Jewish lineage, but their parents or grandparents hid the fact that they were Jewish until fairly recently. It's almost like I've heard it now so many times, this story of somebody who's in their 20s and their grandmother is very ill, and sort of comes out as a Jew on her deathbed, and then the person like walks into the JCC or walks into the museum and is like, I just found out I'm Jewish, like what do I do? And there's two pretty good books out there that look at this phenomenon. Katka Rezka's Return of the Jew is a good study of that. It's her dissertation. She interviewed 35 or 40 people who had that narrative and why it was that they reacted in the way that they did to the discovery of this information. And the question about guilt, I didn't hear much about guilt, actually. That's all I can say. Thanks, you all, for coming. I appreciate it. Please come to the other talks in the series. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.